What if everything you were taught about God since childhood was, in fact, an incomplete, twisted, and deliberately edited version of the truth? What if the being described in the Bible's opening pages wasn't the supreme God, the creator of the universe, but rather a lesser entity, possessive, with jealousy and fury, who kept humanity shackled in ignorance to preserve his own power? This isn't blasphemy. This isn't atheism. This is exactly what some of the earliest Christians believed, taught, and died for. There's something that was buried nearly 2 millennia ago, burned on pyres, purged from libraries, hunted down with sword and flame, that is now resurfacing with a power no institution can hold back. And that something is called Gnosis, the forbidden knowledge, the revelation Jesus supposedly gave not to the masses, but to those with ears to hear. Ever wonder why a God of love crafted a world brimming with suffering? Why forbid knowledge in Eden? Why drown almost all humanity in the flood? Why command wars, massacres, the enslavement of entire peoples? These questions gnaw at you because they expose a contradiction no one in the church is going to help you untangle. This isn't just another shallow religious debate. It's not a faith-bashing session. And it's definitely not cheap sci-fi or some wild conspiracy theory. What you're about to see here is based on real texts, unearthed, scrutinized by serious scholars, texts the early church tried with all its might to obliterate, surviving hidden in the Egyptian desert for over 1600 years. By the end of this, you'll grasp who the Gnostics truly were, what they taught about the true God in contrast to the Creator God, what the forbidden Gospels spill about Jesus and his real mission, why this knowledge was squashed with such brutality, and how it all ties into your life, your spirituality, and your modern search for meaning. But first, I need to drop something on you that's going to flip how you see this entire presentation. There's a specific moment, a passage almost nobody knows, tucked away in one of those Gnostic texts unearthed in 1945, where Jesus describes the Old Testament God in words no conventional theologian would ever repeat from a pulpit. And once you hear them, everything's going to click in a way there's no coming back from. Brace yourself, because what comes next is going to absolutely rattle everything you thought you knew about God, about Jesus, about creation, and about yourself. There's been a silent war raging for 2 millennia, not a war of swords or armies. It's a war of narratives, a battle fought over who controls the story you believe about the cosmos, the origin of life, the nature of the divine, and your place in it all. And this war started long before you were born, but its fallout is evident in every doubt you've ever harbored about faith, every contradiction you've spotted in the Bible that you couldn't reconcile, every time you've gazed at the world's suffering and wondered how a good God could allow it. What you're about to uncover here is that this questioning, this tension, this spiritual unease so many folks carry, isn't a weakness of faith. It's actually the echo of a far older, far deeper truth that was ripped from you before you ever had a shot at knowing it. If you've ever felt like there's something nobody's telling you about spirituality, about the Bible, about Jesus' true teachings, then hit that like button right now, because this video was made specifically for you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next, because the conversation we're kicking off today is going to keep unfolding in ways that'll blow your mind. And drop a comment below with the word Gnos if you're ready to dive into this forbidden knowledge. I want to see how many folks showed up with an open mind. Now let's get down to brass tacks. And the beginning, in this case, is stranger and more gripping than you can possibly imagine. Back in 1945, an Egyptian peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Salman was digging for fertilizer near a rocky cliffside in the Nag Hammadi region of Upper Egypt. What he unearthed that afternoon would forever alter the course of Christianity, philosophy, and human spirituality. Buried in the earth, sealed inside a clay jar, was a trove of 13 leather-bound codices containing over 50 Coptic text writings no human eye had laid upon for more than 1600 years. These texts came to be known as the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, representing the largest cache of Gnostic scriptures ever discovered. Among them, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John, and dozens more texts the early Catholic Church had branded heretical, dangerous, and worthy of total obliteration. For centuries, their mere existence was known only through the furious rebuttals penned by the Church Fathers, who cited them only to condemn them. The originals were gone, vanished. Everyone believed they'd been utterly annihilated. But the desert, it kept its secrets. To grasp why these texts are such bombshells, you gotta understand who the Gnostics were and what they preached. Gnosis, from the Greek, means knowledge but not just any knowledge. This was an inner, direct, experiential knowing of the divine, an illumination that completely reshaped the human-cosmos relationship. The Gnostics didn't believe salvation came from blind faith or obedience to external rituals. For them, salvation was the fruit of deep self-knowledge, an awakening to the true divine nature residing within each person. But what made Gnosticism truly revolutionary and truly menacing to religious authorities was its cosmology, its theory of how and by whom the universe was created. Gnostics drew a radical distinction between two types of divinity. On one side, the true, supreme, unknowable, perfect God, the source of all light and fullness, whom they called the pleroma, Greek for fullness. This true God would never directly mess with raw matter, with suffering, with the imperfection of the physical world. On the other side, there was the creator of the material world, an entity they called the Demiurge, Greek for craftsman or maker. And here's the bombshell the Gnostics dropped right into the heart of institutional Judaism and Christianity. For them, the Demiurge, the creator of the physical world described in the book of Genesis, was not the supreme God. He was a lesser entity, ignorant of his own origin, who mistakenly believed himself to be the only God in existence. A powerful being, sure, but limited, jealous, and controlling, his dominion extending only over the material world, the realm of illusion, imperfection, and death. When you pore over the Apocryphon of John, one of the most pivotal Nag Hammadi texts, you'll find a description of the Demiurge that'll leave you breathless. The text lays out how this entity created the material world through ignorance, then proudly proclaimed to the void, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me." The Gnostics saw in that line, almost a literal quote from the book of Exodus, proof that the Old Testament God was precisely the arrogant, limited Demiurge they described. A being who denies the existence of other divine beings because he's steeped in his own ignorance. This wasn't some idea pulled out of thin air. It sprang from a deeply attentive reading of the Hebrew texts themselves, the internal contradictions, the inconsistencies of character, the moments where the divine behavior described in Scripture seemed utterly incompatible with a being of absolute perfection. The Gnostics queried, why would a perfect, omniscient God need to ask Adam where he was hiding in the garden? Why would an infinitely merciful God command the extermination of men, women, and children? Why would a God who is love describe himself as jealous? To the Gnostic mind, the answer was simple and devastating, because the being described in these passages wasn't the true, supreme, perfect God. It was the Demiurge, the flawed craftsman, exerting his control over the material world he'd cobbled together. That distinction changed everything, and that's precisely why it had to be obliterated. Now we hit the point where the story gets even more unsettling. The Gnostics weren't some fringe group of crackpots. In the early centuries of Christianity, before the church was institutionalized and its dogmas cemented, Gnosticism was one of the most powerful and intellectually sophisticated currents of Christian thought. Figures like Valentinus, Basilides, and Marcion commanded followings in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, the ancient world's most vital cultural hubs. Valentinus was even a contender for Bishop of Rome before a more conservative faction seized control. The Gospel of Thomas, found among the Nag Hammadi texts, is regarded by many secular academics as potentially as old as the canonical Gospels, perhaps even predating the Gospel of John. It contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, many with direct parallels in the canonical Gospels, yet with subtle but significant differences pointing to an alternative Christian tradition. A tradition where the focus isn't on Jesus' death and resurrection as an atoning sacrifice, but on transformative teaching, inner knowledge, spiritual awakening. What was uncovered at Nag Hammadi isn't some minor archaeological curiosity. It's a window into a Christianity that existed, that was vibrant, that had real communities of people praying, meditating, seeking the divine, and that was systematically scrubbed from the historical record. And understanding why that erasure happened is to grasp something far deeper about power, religion, and the nature of spiritual control that stretches all the way into our present day. But there's something even more specific that needs to be said about Jesus and the Gnostics, something that will utterly reshape your perception of Christ's mission, and that's where things become truly impossible to brush aside. Picture this. You grew up believing a story told to you by loved ones, taught in places you held sacred, shaping your identity, your values, your worldview, and your connection to the divine. Now imagine that story, that narrative you considered complete and true, was actually a carefully edited version, entire chapters ripped out, essential characters whitewashed, the central meaning twisted so skillfully that even the editors themselves might not have fully grasped what they were suppressing. That's the ground we're standing on now, and I'm not talking speculation. I'm talking real documents, concrete historical evidence, texts that survived centuries of deliberate persecution, and, when read closely, unveil a figure of Jesus radically different from the one canonized by the official church. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus drops a line that never shows up in the 4 canonical Gospels. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. This statement, so unlike the theology of salvation by faith or by works, points to a Jesus teaching radical inner transformation, a process of self-knowledge and awakening that's the very core of the Gnostic tradition. In the Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, there's an even more explosive assertion. The text suggests that resurrection wasn't a future physical event, but a spiritual experience that should happen in this life, and that anyone waiting for resurrection only after death had completely missed the point of Jesus' teaching. Those who say that the Lord first died and then rose are mistaken, for he first rose and then died. To minds steeped in traditional Christian theology, this inversion seems heretical, absurd, impossible. But within the Gnostic cosmology, it carries a powerful internal logic. If the material world is the domain of the Demiurge of illusion, of ignorance, then true resurrection is the awakening to the pleroma, to divine fullness, while still embodied. The death of the body is merely the final liberation for those who've already awakened. For those still slumbering, it's simply the end. Then there's the Apocryphon of John, widely considered by many scholars to be the most crucial Gnostic text ever unearthed. In it, Jesus appears to the Apostle John after the resurrection and unveils a complete, detailed cosmology profoundly different from anything in the canonical Gospels. He describes the supreme God, the invisible Father, as a being of pure, perfect light, utterly beyond description, formless, boundless, without need. And then he details how, through a series of emanations, the spiritual cosmos was created, and how, at some point, a fall, a misstep, occurred, resulting in the material world's creation by an entity that called itself God, but was, in truth, an ignorant shadow of the truly divine. What's most unnerving about this text is how it completely reinterprets the book of Genesis. The serpent in the Garden of Eden, the symbol of evil and temptation in the canonical narrative, in the Apocryphon of John appears as an agent of the true God, sent to liberate Adam and Eve from the ignorance imposed by the Demiurge. The prohibition against eating from the fruit of knowledge is then read not as a moral test, but as an attempt at control to keep human beings in the dark, away from Gnosis, away from the divine spark that resided within them. When you read that, something clicks. Because suddenly the story you've known since childhood, the fall from Eden as the original sin that condemned humanity, takes on an entirely different contour. And the question that burns, a question that sears, is, what if the Gnostics were right? What if the serpent was the hero? Now you're starting to get why this knowledge had to be destroyed. The Forbidden Gospels aren't just alternative texts about Jesus. They represent an entire worldview, a spiritual and philosophical framework that positioned human beings as carriers of a divine spark, a sliver of the true God trapped in matter, whose destiny was to awaken and return to the fullness from which it came. In this view, humanity wasn't fundamentally sinful, fundamentally flawed, fundamentally dependent on external authority for salvation. It was, at its deepest essence, divine. And now you get the problem. You understand why this idea had to be eradicated from the face of the earth with an urgency the early church treated as a matter of institutional survival. Because if every human carries within them a spark of the supreme divine, if the path to God is internal and direct, if salvation is about awakening and not obedience, then what need would you have for priests, for sacraments, for ecclesiastical hierarchies, for intermediaries between you and the divine? Gnosis wasn't just a theological heresy. It was an existential threat to institutional power. Are you feeling the weight of this? This realization that there's a deeper layer to humanity's spiritual history that was deliberately hidden. If you've made it this far and you're feeling like something monumental is being unveiled, that the pieces are clicking into place like never before, then type the word SPARK in the comments right now. I want to see how many folks are awake to this, because what comes next is even more eye-opening. We're going to talk about the concrete evidence of this erasure, who made the calls, when they were made, and precisely what was lost when the Gnostic texts were forever banished from the official records of Christianity. The Council of Nicaea, held in 325 CE, is often pitched as an event of theological unification, a moment when Christian leaders gathered to settle doctrinal disputes and solidify the Church. What's rarely mentioned is that this council was convened and presided over by an unbaptized Roman emperor, Constantine, a man who dedicated much of his life to the cult of Sol Invictus, and who viewed the empire's religious unification as a political tool of immense utility. The decisions made at Nicaea weren't just theological. They were political, strategic, and had ramifications that echo to this very day. But the process of canonizing Christian scriptures wasn't a one-and-done deal. It was a long, violent, deliberate process spanning over 3 centuries, and throughout that entire time, Gnostic communities existed, taught, and produced texts with the same claim of apostolic authenticity as the writings that would eventually be selected as canonical. Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, in the late 2nd century, authored a 5-volume work titled Against Heresies, which is, in effect, the most detailed document we possess on Gnostic beliefs precisely because he quoted them extensively to refute them. Without Irenaeus, we'd have far less insight into what the Gnostics truly taught. What Irenaeus inadvertently makes clear, though, is that Gnosticism wasn't some marginal cult of wild-eyed visionaries. It was an intellectually sophisticated movement, with elaborate philosophical systems, its own sacred texts, rituals, communities, and a tradition of knowledge transmission that claimed direct apostolic lineage. Valentinus, the most influential Gnostic of the 2nd century, asserted he'd received his tradition from Theudas, who was supposedly a direct disciple of the Apostle Paul. Basilides claimed secret teachings from Glaucius, an interpreter for Peter. These claims of apostolic lineage were exactly the same ones used by the factions that would eventually become orthodoxy. The difference wasn't in the antiquity of the tradition. It was in political power. And when Constantine embraced Christianity as the empire's religion, the version he championed was the one best suited to the hierarchical structure he needed to govern, the version with bishops wielding centralized authority, sacraments controlled by clergy, and a theology where God was absolute sovereign and the emperor ruled by his grace. Gnostic theology, with its focus on direct inner knowledge and its inherent distrust of intermediate authorities, was fundamentally incompatible with that power project. The evidence of deliberate suppression is abundant and well documented. Emperor Theodosius's decree in 381 CE made Nicene Christianity the official religion of the empire and declared all dissenters heretics. This wasn't merely a matter of academic theology. It was a legal issue with real consequences. Gnostic communities were broken up. Their texts were seized and torched. Their leaders hunted down. Epiphanius of Salamis, a theologian from the late 4th century, put together a catalogue of heresies called the Panarion, detailing over 80 groups deemed heretical. His notes lay bare the wild diversity of early Christian thought before the whole thing got steamrolled into one official version. What makes the Nag Hammadi discoveries so damn powerful as evidence is that they back up what those heresy hunters were saying, but from the inside. We're not just talking about opponents describing the enemy. These are the texts themselves, and the actual voice of the traditions that got squashed. And the intellectual heft of these writings, the sheer depth of their cosmology, the beauty of their spiritual language, it makes it impossible to just brush them off as some fringe delusion. The Gospel of Truth, for instance, attributed to Valentinus himself, is a spiritual meditation of extraordinary literary beauty. It describes awakening as the moment of being, asleep amidst nightmares, finally wakes up and realizes the terror it felt had no real substance. Ignorance, the nightmare, the imprisoning material world, all of it just melts away when you encounter true knowledge, with the Father. Any modern reader who stumbles onto this text immediately gets it. This isn't some sectarian screed. It's a spiritual work of genuine depth. And there's the whole deal with the Gospel of Judas, found not in Nag Hammadi but in Egypt under different circumstances, finally released in 2006 after decades of delicate negotiations and restoration. In that text, Judas isn't the backstabbing traitor who sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. He's the most enlightened disciple, the only one who truly grasped Jesus' mission, to free the divine spark trapped in the physical body. Handing Jesus over to the authorities wasn't betrayal. It was a sacred act, done at Christ's own request. National Geographic and a team of heavy-hitting academics from Harvard, Yale, and other top-tier institutions spent years authenticating and translating this thing. It's real. It's from the 2nd or early 3rd century. And it absolutely flips the script on the most famous villain in Western history. All this piled-up evidence points to one conclusion that's tough to dodge. What we call Christianity today is the outcome of a selection process that wasn't divine, but deeply human, political, and strategic. Texts weren't just picked for how old or authentic they were, but for how well they fit a specific power structure. And the writings that pushed for an inner, direct spirituality, one not mediated by institutions, those got systematically scrubbed. But wiping out texts is a whole different ballgame than wiping out truths. And that's why, 2,000 years later, these ideas are bubbling back up to the surface with a force no institution can suppress anymore. There's a question serious historians always ask when they look into the erasure of Gnosticism, and it tells you a lot about the psychology of religious power. Why was the persecution so damn intense? If Gnostics were just some fringe group of mystics with weird ideas, why did the early church pour so much intellectual effort, so much political capital, and so much physical violence into wiping them out? The answer's uncomfortable, but it's gotta be said. Because Gnostic ideas were genuinely dangerous to the institutional power project. Not dangerous in a moral sense, but dangerous in the way they made the institution obsolete. Think about that for a second. If the dominant tradition preaches that humans are fundamentally sinful, separated from God by nature, and the only way to get close to the divine is through sacraments dished out by an ordained clergy within a specific hierarchy, well then, you need the church. You depend on it. Your salvation absolutely has to go through it. But if the Gnostic tradition tells you that you carry a spark of the true God inside you, that inner knowledge is the direct path to the divine, that salvation is about waking up, not institutional obedience, then the church becomes not just unnecessary, but a damn obstacle, an imposed middleman between you and your own divine nature. That's the fundamental difference that justified centuries of persecution. It wasn't about abstract theology, it was about power, dependence, and control, pure and simple. The wipeout didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, methodical, and often sneaky. In the early centuries, the strategy was all rhetoric. Heresy hunters like Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Hippolytus penned entire volumes refuting Gnostic doctrines, trying to shame them intellectually, accusing their followers of immorality, depravity, and demonic deception. A lot of those accusations were obviously bogus, convenient projections designed to discredit the opponent before their ideas could even get a fair hearing. When political power finally hooked up with the church in the 4th century, the strategy shifted from rhetoric to brute physical coercion. Texts got burned. Communities got scattered. Belonging to a heretical group became a punishable crime. And for centuries, history was written by the victors, who had every reason to spin the version of Christianity that won out as the only one that ever existed, the only authentic one, the only apostolic one. But the wipeout was never complete. The Gnostic tradition clung on, surviving in various forms through the centuries. The Cathars in southern France, in the 12th and 13th centuries, taught a dualistic cosmology eerily similar to Gnosticism, drawing a line between a good God and a creator of the material world identified with evil. The Albigensian Crusade of 1209 was called by Pope Innocent III specifically to exterminate the Cathars, leading to one of the biggest slaughters in European medieval history. The city of Béziers was burned to the ground with its entire population, estimated between 20 and 30,000 people, Christians and Cathars alike, with the infamous line attributed to the papal legate. Kill them all. God will recognize his own. The Manichaeans, followers of Mani, a 3rd century prophet who forged a synthesis of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism with clear Gnostic elements, were hounded across the Roman Empire and the Islamic world for centuries. Young Augustine of Hippo, before he became the most influential theologian in the Christian West, was a Manichaean for almost a decade, which tells you a lot about the intellectual pull these traditions had for sophisticated minds. In Jewish Kabbalah, especially in the 13th century Zohar, we find elements that mirror Gnostic concepts, including the idea that divine emanations are separate from the Ein Sof, the infinite and unknowable God, in a way that resonates with the Gnostic distinction between the supreme God and the Demiurge. In Islamic Sufism, the quest for direct inner knowledge of the divine, for Gnosis in its most fundamental sense, stayed alive even within traditions that officially rejected Gnosticism as heresy. Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychologist who reshaped Western thought on the human psyche, was captivated by Gnosticism. He saw it as a profound symbolic expression of the individuation process, that journey to become fully oneself, which he considered the core aim of human psychological development. In 1915, Jung had a series of visions that deeply rattled him, visions he later described as encounters with Gnostic figures, especially Abraxas, the supreme Gnostic God who transcends the opposition between good and evil. These experiences culminated in the esoteric text known as the Seven Sermons to the Dead, which Jung attributed to the Gnostic Basilides. When the Nag Hammadi discoveries finally saw the light of day, Jung was so moved that the Jung Institute in Zurich snapped up one of the codices. He said these texts represented exactly what he'd been chasing his whole life in deep psychology, the voice of humanity's deepest psyche expressing its quest for totality, for a return to wholeness. And here's something you rarely hear. The traditions that got suppressed never truly vanished. They stayed alive in dreams, in mystical experiences, in the visions of those searching for something beyond what institutional religions could dish out. Wiping out the texts didn't wipe out the inner experience those texts tried to describe. And today, at a time when traditional religious institutions are facing unprecedented credibility crises, when millions of people describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, the return of these Gnostic ideas hits different. It resonates far beyond mere historical interest. If you're watching this, chances are you've felt it too. That gut feeling that the answers institutional religions are peddling don't quite hit the mark. That hunch there's something more, something deeper, more direct, truer than any doctrine cooked up by a council of bishops. That flash of connection with something infinite that sometimes hits you in the most unexpected moments, and no theology can ever quite capture it. The Gnostics would have told you that experience. That's exactly the divine spark inside you recognizing its origin. It's the pleroma calling its own spark home. And maybe that's the most forbidden truth of all, not some claim about the identity of the Old Testament God, but the assertion that you, at the deepest core of your being, are made of the same stuff as the Supreme Divine. Traditions from all over the globe, from every era, point to this same inner truth. Hindu Vedanta declares Atman is Brahman. The individual self is identical to the universal absolute. Mahayana Buddhism talks about the inherent Buddha nature in all beings. Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart, Hildegard von Bingen, and John of the Cross describe experiences of union with the divine that dangerously skirt Gnostic language. Rumi and Ibn Arabi's Sufism describes love as the being's impulse toward its source. Kabbalah speaks of the divine spark, the nitzatz, trapped in matter and seeking its return to the Ein Sof. The convergence here is impossible to ignore. From wildly different cultures across vastly different eras, with no contact between them, human beings arrived at the same fundamental insight, that there's a dimension of reality completely separate from the world our senses pick up, that this dimension isn't outside us but within, and that getting to it doesn't hinge on middlemen, dogmas, or institutions. It's about a deep inner transformation, sometimes called enlightenment, sometimes gnosis, sometimes awakening, but it always points to the same territory. What Christian Gnosticism layered onto this universal perception was a specific cosmological take. If the material world is the domain of a limited, imperfect entity, if the reality we perceive is some kind of illusion managed by the Demiurge, then the spiritual quest isn't about fixing up this world or conforming to its rules. It's about waking up from the illusion, recognizing that divine spark inside you, and starting the journey back to the pleroma, to the fullness that was always your true nature. And that, my friend, is a message that's still radically revolutionary 2,000 years later, because it tells you you're not broken. You're not fundamentally sinful or flawed. You don't need saving from the outside. What you need is to remember who the hell you really are. If you haven't already hit that subscribe button, now's the time. Because what we just dove into together, that's just the tip of the iceberg for a journey that's going to keep unfolding in a lot more videos, and you don't want to miss a single one. Every piece of content we drop here is built for exactly this. To blow open what you know about spirituality, history, and consciousness in a way no textbook or institution is ever going to give you. And before we roll on, I gotta ask you something straight up. After everything we've uncovered so far, after understanding there's a whole spiritual tradition that was deliberately squashed, that Gnostic texts survived 2,000 years of persecution to finally reach you now, after realizing that the idea of a divine spark inside you isn't some mystical fantasy, but one of the most widely convergent insights in all of human history, did you already know, somehow, that the official story of spirituality was incomplete? Hit the comments below with a YS or NO. I really want to know what's going through your head right now, because the conversation we're having down in those comments is just as crucial as the video itself. I need you to hit pause for a second, not just in your head, not some abstract thought. I want you to literally stop, take a deep breath, and really feel the weight of what we're talking about here. Because there's a subtle danger when we dig into ideas this expansive. The risk of just consuming them as interesting intellectual info and letting them pass without truly hitting what needs to be hit. And what needs to be hit isn't in your head. It's somewhere way deeper. Think about your own spiritual journey. Not the cleaned up version you tell other people, not the one you trot out in conversations about religion and philosophy, but the real, intimate version, the one that happens in the dead of night when you can't sleep and the big questions just show up, uninvited. Have you ever felt profoundly alone in the universe? Have you ever looked up at the night sky and felt, simultaneously, your own insignificance and something that can only be described as recognition, like that vastness was, somehow, familiar? Have you ever had a moment of such absolute clarity, even if it only lasted a few seconds, where everything just clicked, where the separation between you and the rest of existence just faded away? The Gnostics would have called those moments glimpses of the pleroma. The Buddhist tradition would label them kensho, a flash of Buddha nature. Christian mystics would talk about divine consolation. But here's what all these traditions agree on. These moments aren't illusions. They're not products of imagination or wishful thinking. They are quite the opposite, the only times when our usual perception of what we call reality gives way to something that's more real, not less. The rub is, our culture, including institutional religious culture, has trained us to distrust these experiences, to relativize them, explain them away neurologically, or, in the case of more conservative religious traditions, to funnel them exclusively within approved doctrinal structures. A mystical experience outside the official parameters is eyed with suspicion, sometimes even horror, as if the spontaneity of the divine were a threat, instead of being precisely what the divine is by nature. The Gnostics built elaborate systems with their eons, their archons, their emanations of the pleroma, not because they believed complex mental maps were the truth, but because they understood the human mind needs structures to start navigating territories that are beyond language. The map isn't the territory. But without any map at all, most folks are never going to venture into the territory. Gnostic texts were maps, invitations to an inner journey each person had to take for themselves. And this maybe is the most critical takeaway from this whole video. The knowledge we're chewing on here can't be passively consumed. You can't just hear about the divine spark and then go right back to being exactly who you were. Or rather, you can. But if you do, you'll have picked up the key, held it in your hand for a moment, and then just let it drop. What the Gnostics called awakening isn't some belief you adopt. It's an orientation you choose, over and over, in every single moment. It's the choice to question the narratives you've been fed about who you are, what you deserve, what's even possible for you. It's the willingness to sit with the discomfort of questions that don't have easy answers, instead of just grabbing ready-made ones that ease the tension but block real growth. It's the practice of returning, always, to that inner dimension where the world's noise quiets down and something far more silent, far more real, can finally be heard. There's a line attributed to Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas that I've carried with me for years. He says, "The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and men do not see it. It's not up in heaven. It's not waiting after you die. It's not reserved for those who checked off the right rituals or swore by the approved doctrines. It's spread out across the earth. It's right here, right now, in this very moment. And the only reason we don't see it is because we're looking in the wrong damn place outward instead of inward, to external authority instead of to the inner source." And that insight, when it truly lands, when it stops being just an idea and starts becoming a lived experience, it changes everything. The way you deal with suffering, the way you face uncertainty, the way you see yourself in moments of failure and moments of triumph, the way you relate to others, knowing that every human being you cross paths with carries that same spark, that same pleroma in miniature, regardless of how they act, what they believe, or where they come from. This isn't naivety. It's not about denying the suffering or cruelty that exists in the world. It's about seeing past them, not to ignore them, but to act from a place deeper than fear, deeper than anger, deeper than the need to be right or to win. It's what the Gnostics called the pneumatic being, one who acts from the spirit, in contrast to the psychic, who acts from the emotional soul, and the hylic, who acts only from matter. What this knowledge asks of you isn't to ditch your religious tradition, burn your holy books, or declare war on institutions. It just asks you to go deeper, to not settle for surface answers to profound questions, to seriously consider the possibility that there's something inside you that's older, vaster, and more real than any identity you've ever built for yourself. That's the kind of reflection Gnostic texts spark, and it doesn't come with an expiration date. So, after all this, the question that really hits home is a practical one. What do you do with it? Because knowledge that just sits in the intellectual sphere, that only serves to impress in conversations or give you a temporary mental buzz, well, it misses the point. Gnosis, by definition, is transformative. It's knowledge that changes who you are, not just what you know. The most concrete first step this knowledge suggests is the practice of radically questioning automatic narratives. Every Gnostic tradition, in its various forms, starts with the same move, a refusal to accept as definitive truth what's been handed down without examination. Not out of empty intellectual rebellion, but out of a genuine love for truth. Socrates called it lenchus, the rigorous examination of beliefs. The Gnostics called it discernment between true knowledge and the Demiurge's illusion. In practice, that means sitting with, but the beliefs you've inherited about God, about human nature, about what's possible, and honestly ask yourself, where did these come from? Do they serve your liberation or your imprisonment? Do they open you up or shut you down? The second step is to seriously cultivate inner silence. Every tradition that touches Gnostic ground, from Christian mysticism to Zen Buddhism, from Kabbalah to Vedanta, acknowledges that accessing the deepest dimension of reality requires a quality of stillness that modern life systematically conspires to prevent. I'm not talking about meditation as a wellness technique or a productivity hack, though those benefits are real. I'm talking about meditation as a practice of recognition, of repeatedly returning to the silence from which everything emerges, to recognize that silence as your most fundamental nature. The Gnostics who sought refuge in the Egyptian desert, the ones who eventually hid the Nag Hammadi texts to preserve them, they were contemplatives. They understood that the knowledge they sought wasn't in books, even if books could point to it. It was within every conscious being. The third step is to reinterpret your relationship with suffering. Gnostic cosmology, with its imperfect Demiurge and its material world as a realm of limitation, offers a powerful psychological framework for working with suffering in a way that neither denies it nor absolutizes it. Suffering is real within the domain we exist in, but it's not the ultimate reality. It's a signal that something within is asking for attention, asking for depth, asking for a return to the spark that lies beyond what the Demiurge can reach. Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor and founder of logotherapy, described something fundamentally similar when he realized that even in the absolute horror of the concentration camps, there was an inner dimension that couldn't be taken away. He wasn't a Gnostic, but he touched the same territory. The fourth step is to seek community. One of the most interesting features of early Gnostic communities was their horizontal structure. There wasn't a rigid hierarchy where only the ordained had access to the sacred. There were degrees of initiation, sure, but they were based on genuine spiritual development, not institutional power. Today, that translates into seeking connections with people who are asking the same deep questions, who aren't content with easy answers, who are willing to sit with uncertainty instead of running from it. Study groups, meditation circles, spaces for honest philosophical dialogue, any environment where questioning is welcomed and dogma isn't demanded as a prerequisite for belonging. The fifth step, and perhaps the most paradoxical, is learning to live with not knowing. One of the most liberating things Gnosticism offers, in contrast to religions that demand doctrinal certainties, is permission to dwell in mystery. The true God of the Gnostic system, the father of the pleroma, is consistently described as that which cannot be described, that which transcends all predication, all concepts, all language. This apophasis, this negative theology, which states what God is not precisely because no positive affirmation would suffice semes, is one of the richest and most neglected traditions in spiritual thought. When you let go of needing certainty about ultimate questions, when you can rest in the question instead of craving the answer, something opens up. The tension that consumed energy defending a position dissolves, and that energy can be redirected towards something far more valuable. The direct, moment-to-moment experience of what's happening here and now. At its core, the Gnostic teaching isn't about abstract cosmology. It's not about who created the world or how many eons exist in the pleroma. It's about the fact that you have access right now to a dimension of yourself that wasn't created by the Demiurge, that isn't subject to the limitations of the material world, that doesn't need permission from any external authority to be recognized. And that's the most practical, most applicable, and most transformative information there is. You made it to the end of this video, and that means something. Most people bail out early when the topics get too deep, when the questions get too uncomfortable, when the narrative demands you actually think instead of just consume. You stuck around. You followed this whole journey, from the Council of Nicaea to the caves of the Egyptian desert, from the Nag Hammadi texts to the divine spark the Gnostics said exists within every conscious being. That already puts you in a different league. What we've covered together here was immense. We've seen that Gnosticism wasn't a marginal heresy, but a sophisticated and legitimate Christian tradition that was systematically suppressed for political and power reasons. We've seen that the Nag Hammadi texts survived centuries of persecution to reach us with a core teaching that has never lost its power, that you're not just a material being subject to the judgment of a jealous God, but a spark of the supreme divine in the process of awakening. We've seen that this forbidden knowledge remains more relevant than ever at a time when traditional religious institutions face unprecedented crises and millions of people are seeking a spirituality that is rigorous, honest, and deeply personal all at once. If this video opened something up for you, if it made you see a story you thought you knew completely through new eyes, hit that like button right now. That simple gesture decisively helps the channel keep bringing this kind of content to more people who are asking the same questions. Subscribe here and ring the bell so you don't miss absolutely anything that's coming next, because every video we make is built to go deeper. And for those who made it all the way to the end of this video, who followed every step of this journey, comment below with the phrase "I AMT Spark." I want to see in the comments who the knowledge warriors are who stuck it out, who really grasped the deeper message of what was said here today. And check out this video appearing on your screen now. It's directly connected to everything we've covered here, and it's going to take you even deeper into territory few dare to explore. You definitely don't want to miss it.